So I'm excited for this today. Just want to introduce our two speakers. We have Teddy Manywounds, who is the G4 Justice Director for the Tsuut'ina Nation Treaty 7 territory. Teddy, a Two-Spirit Tsuut'ina First Nation member of Treaty 7, has been the G4 SNTTC's Director of Justice since 2022. Teddy co-chairs the Tsuut'ina Nation Tosguna Police Commission. Since 2022, Teddy has been on an AFN policing task force. Teddy hopes that we can develop mechanisms that honor treaty rights to justice and foster community connection for all people of Turtle Island through conversations that grow our community. Our second speaker today, we have Chief Jerry Jack from Muchalaht First Nation. Chief Jerry Jack is a Hereditary Chief from Muchalaht First Nation, MMFN. Chief Jack has over 40 years of experience working on First Nations issues including justice, policing, governance, fisheries, and environmental management. Currently, Chief Jack is a BCAFN Board and Regional Chief on issues surrounding fisheries, policing, forestry, and governance. All right, let's welcome our two panelists today.
Good afternoon, and I want to say in my language, Siaskas and Anishinish are the two ways of saying thank you for the nations that I'm here representing, which are Tsuut'ina, Tsuut'ina Coded Nations. To open us off in a good way, I wanted to discuss very quickly a perspective on enforcement regarding the way that we are working towards that in Tsuut'ina Nation, the way we are working towards that on our nations regarding our bylaws and enforcement mechanisms, as well as the challenges with policing and enforcement. So I think something that we've all discussed over these past few days are our own source laws and developing those laws, developing those orders. And the second part of that is how do we enforce those and or adjudicate those mechanisms on our nations? On Tsuut'ina Nation, we were always looking for a source of authority in order to do that, in order to adjudicate those in a court of competent jurisdiction. And then there's the jurisdiction piece, which adds another layer of complication as it pertains to our relationships with federal and provincial governments. One of the areas, is that a fire alarm? No, sorry, oh my god, I was like, oh no, we're all in danger, we're all good.
It's the deadly meter, it's going off, Teddy.
Oh, it's okay, thank you. Let's lay down some tobacco. All that's to say, enforcement, as we develop our own laws and legal orders, will remain very much an incumbency based upon the frameworks of where we are and how we are adjudicating the mechanisms of our laws. Laws do require a source of authority, and currently the way policing is set up under the First Nations Inuit policing program does hinder the ability for us to enforce our bylaws and or enforcement mechanisms, at least on Tsuut'ina Nation. What we're never wanting to do is delegate our authority back to provinces as treaty nations. Our relationship is government to government. However, that is not a panacea of a solution for everybody, as we all have distinct government to government relationships. And so one thing that we have worked towards accomplishing on the Tsuut'ina Nation is developing enforcement within at least the contracts of our economic development, otherwise known as TAZA. Because as we are developing TAZA, which is an economic corridor with one of the largest and busiest Costco's in Canada, we also have to account for all of the possibilities that come with economic development and crime. And as we move forward with that consideration, how are we going to enforce our bylaws and our nations our way? One way that we are working on doing this with an enforcement committee on Tsuut'ina Nation is to utilize the government of Alberta, the Court of King's Bench, in order for the tickets and or enforcement or the tickets and or the charges that could be laid onto a person, for those to work those ways through the Court of King's Bench by way of Alberta, but source those tickets and or laws so that the loop mechanism is so much that the crime, or if there is a punitive measure for that crime in the source of any finances, let's say a traffic ticket, that costing comes back to our nation. However, it's complicated because the government of Alberta does not have to do that. They don't have to comply with that under our source laws. And so the negotiations that are gone into regarding the policing and how we are enforcing these laws is further muddied because then we all get into jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is complicated because it offers that ability offers the ability for those who have the power to adjudicate under court systems, and many governments don't want to give up or relinquish any certain amount of power. And so one of the conversations that we have had in Tsuut'ina Nation with both the federal and provincial governments regarding jurisdiction is how are we either determining this or defining this in our laws. On Tsuut'ina Nation, we are also working on a constitution. And within that constitution, we develop frameworks regarding our lands, our land bases, and our rights to not only build and deliver laws, but to adjudicate those under our own court mechanisms, which then complicates another layer to that complication is the funding of court systems. At least for the research that we did, just to get a court off the ground in Tsuut'ina Nation would be anywhere in the range from, depending on the size of infrastructure and needs and capacity, about $5 to $6.5 million, at least on our nation, and that's not in every nation. And it would be very hard, at least the Ministry of Justice, as I have been in negotiations with them, and Minister Mickey Emery in Alberta, for that funding to be diverted from the current court system mechanisms into ours. This all to say, these are the frustrations and the impasses of negotiations that we all enter into and support our leadership to enter into, so that we can not only provide clarity, but we can build the distinctions and we can build the coordination agreements in order for us to achieve this. This is not to say there are ways forward utilizing creativity in our nation and how we're going to do that. So, for instance, within our economic corridors for our those, let's use like Costco for instance. Because they are on Tsuut'ina Nation, we retain the jurisdiction over policing services in that space. So if somebody commits a crime at Costco, our policing service is the policing service that is the first in control and command. And the same goes for our Grey Eagle Casino. However, in order for us to develop mechanisms of enforcement, we do require currently coordination agreements with the City of Calgary in order for us to coordinate an ability to lay a charge and otherwise adjudicate that charge. However, that can muddy the waters because what we are not trying to do in that system is to delegate our authority or relinquish that authority back to a system that is not our own. That all to say, it's one creative way forward that can also provide complications and take us 2 steps back, depending on the powers of the day and those who are in government. And so how we have found agreeable ways forward is to maintain positive relationships with the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Services, who I also consider a very close friend, which is Mike Ellis in Alberta, as well as the Minister of Justice, Mickey Emery in Alberta, and the current Premier, Daniel Smith. All this to say, these intergovernmental relationships are not only incumbent and important, but they assist us in moving forward the ability for our police forces to enforce our laws sufficiently, while also being provided and provisioned the ability to do so. I say provisioned the ability to do so, because everything does come with a cost. However, we need to look at that cost as a value added back into community. So for instance, on our nations, we have very strong laws as it comes to trespassing. However, it's very hard to remove trespassers without a BCR, and many of us have those mechanisms on our First Nations. And it can complicate, and on Stoney Nakoda that is currently a concern, it can complicate the process and exacerbate the emergency if our police services are not able to enforce our laws sufficiently, and then not only to enforce those laws, but to make sure there are systems in place to mitigate the possibility of those laws being broken again. So recidivism. All this to say, how we are working forward to that in Tsuut'ina Nation is maintaining positive government relationships while coordinating agreements with the courts of jurisdiction currently, which is the Court of King's Bench in Alberta, and the City of Calgary Police Service. Again, those coordination agreements are agreements that don't delegate our authorities, but they do allow us a way forward while also building our own laws. Again, once we have a court of competent jurisdiction that is recognized under the Court of King's Bench, then we may have a mechanism to enact our laws, as they do in Siksika. Siksika does have that mechanism. One thing that they are currently working on, which I have a meeting with them when I get back, is a policing service, when you have your own policing service, it can be transformative, and there are a lot of incumbencies in order for us to get past that goal line to enforce and adjudicate our laws and our enforcement. It's not to say it's impossible, it's to say these are complications that are put forward, and when working with outside sources, when we're working with outside sources of authority, we can get creative in finding ways forward so that we have benefit in our lands for our people, while also supporting our policing services and recognizing that even though the current governments of the day have a difficult time relinquishing their authority over our jurisdiction, we remain steadfast to say our laws and bylaws are within our own jurisdiction and developed for our own success within our community, by our community, so that we are not using enforcement mechanisms that can cause more harm. And so from that, I'm going to bring up Chief Jerry Jack, and then we're going to take part in a conversation with one another. And I do encourage us to have a conversation. Again, I just sat in a really, really wonderful, and thank you, presentation prior to this about source laws and legislation. There was only, I'm not sure what the other presentations were, but there was such a beautiful presentation on self-government agreements and a caribou law that was so impactful and revolutionary and transformative from what I was hearing, which gave me a lot of ideas forward. And so I'm hoping at this last part of our day is to share ideas as to how we can move forward. How can we encourage one another? I always say too, in justice and public safety, and this comes from my grandmother, the only thing is a bad idea is one that wasn't shared in the first place. And so I'm really looking forward to having a conversation. And without further ado, Chief Jerry Jack.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Muchalaht. I come from the House of Tsuut'ina in Muchalaht territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I am a Hereditary Chief for my nation. We don't elect our chief and council. We don't have elections. We're on a hereditary system, and it's working really well. I want to thank the Musqueam, Squamish, and Selective people for allowing me to be here today and to talk to you folks. And thank you folks for taking your time to listen to me. When the FN staff called me to speak, they said, it's up to me, so I don't have any notes. But having said all of that, I am a retired RCMP officer. I did all my service in British Columbia, and I only did 17 years because I just couldn't take the racism anymore in the force. I went through a lot. And when I first started, and we were talking about bylaws, and when I first started, back in about 92, all the police officers on the island took a course on how to enforce banned bylaws. Now they don't even do that, and it's really frustrating that they won't, because when I joined the RCMP, I signed on a dotted line saying I shall enforce all laws of Canada. And a banned bylaw is a law of Canada. So I should be able to enforce it, but they won't do that. And I do have a good relationship with all the detachment commanders that come to my territory. I do sit on the National AFN Policing and Justice Task Force together with, and we're working hard to, I wish we had a self-administered police force in my territory. We don't have that. All we have is RCMP. And because we would be better off looking after our own people, enforcing our own laws. Because that's how we did it a long time ago. And I also sit on a BC First Nations Justice Council Steering Committee on Policing and Justice as well. And thank you. And they're miles ahead on a lot of issues and a lot of things, and I'm really proud to be part of that, and proud to be asked to sit on that steering committee. And talking about police shootings, I was given commissioner's commendation because I didn't shoot somebody when I was stationed in Muchalaht. I could have, and I had to live with that every day when I had my shotgun out and I was just a trigger pull away because the guy was walking towards me with his, but it ended well. He only got hurt because he got pepper sprayed and his face was got a little dirty from the mud because he wanted water and I gave it to him. But I also retired in '04 and I went to visit my late sister. She lived in Nia Bay, Washington. And when I was sitting with her, I said, I heard Quinault has a nice casino. And she says, look up the website. So I looked up Quinault Nation and at the bottom it said HR police officers needed. Picked up the phone and I phoned the police chief, Chief Ralston, and I explained to him that I'm a status Indian from BC and I just retired from the RCMP in Canada and I see you're looking for officers and he says, we're having interviews tomorrow, would you be interested in coming down? Sure, so I drove 4 hours from the Bay to Quinault, sat in front of a police commission for an hour and a half. They fired questions at me. When I was done, the police chief says, can I see you in my office in 30 minutes? And I said, yeah, so I went in and we sat down in his office and the first thing out of his mouth was, can you start tomorrow? And I said, no, I don't have any documents allowing me to, so I drove to Blaine and spoke to the border guards and they said I needed a letter from my nation saying that I had more than 50% native blood in me. And I got it, gave it to them. They gave me a work authorization permit. I went to Port Angeles, got a social security card, went to Tohola, found a place to live, and I went to work. And I was supposed to go to, they call it FLETC, it's a Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But my police chief said, every time my name came up to go, he said, oh no, you don't have to go. Yeah, so I never did go to FLETC, and I should have went. And a few years later, I was working up in Nia Bay because they needed extra officers because their population increases by thousands overnight for Macaw days. And the police chief there really liked my work, my paperwork and everything like that. So he asked me if I'd consider working for him, and I said yeah. So I gave my 2 weeks notice and I moved to Nia Bay and worked there. And it was a very interesting place to work. I enjoyed it more than the RCMP because everything down there is so different. They have their own courts, they have their own laws. There's tribal law, state law, federal law, and everybody that was arrested got urine analysis, basically a P test. And if they tested positive for alcohol, they used to get charged for possession of alcohol. And the same thing with narcotics. If it showed positive for narcotics, they got charged for possession of narcotics as well. So they do things a lot different down there. They have their own courts, their family, civil, and law courts, which is really good. And I hope that we have that one day up here in Canada. And I heard in the previous speakers across the room, they were talking about rental things. And down in Nia Bay, the tenant signs on a document saying that when they move out, all their walls get swabbed, and if it tests positive for narcotic, they have to replace all the walls, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I had to give a speech in Parliament one day, and I was introducing myself, and I said, you know, my great-grandfather was arrested for having a potlatch. and he went to jail. I said, my grandmother, she went to jail in 1982 for protesting downtown Vancouver for ladies who lost their status. She was 69 years old, and 4 police officers picked her up and dragged her to jail. My dad went to jail many times for fighting for our rights. I've been learning everything that I have since 1975. I've been involved with my dad, my late dad, and working to make our communities better. And I just at the end, when I was talking, and I talked about my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my grandmother, my dad all being arrested, and I said, what did I do? I joined the RCMP. And my dad didn't like it at first because he was hauled away by Mounties and Red Search and taken to residential school. And so he had no use for police, but I chose that profession because I said to myself, there's not going to be logging forever, there's pulp mill won't last, the fishing isn't good, there's always going to be criminals. So I joined the RCMP. Anyway, that's my story, and just say thank you for listening to me. And I did move back home in 2008 because my dad handed this chieftainship to me in 2000, and I officially, for the last 8 years, I've grown up because I thought to myself, I better do what the responsibility that my dad gave me. So I find myself involved in a lot of things, and it's an honor to be on a board member for the BCAFN and to be on the task force and the Justice Council steering committee. I really like the work we're doing, and I hope one day that my strive is to get things better, because we don't have self-administered police forces in British here, and we have those darn tripartite agreements that don't work. And I was on a national meeting with the chief superintendent or whatever he is from Ottawa was on the line, and I asked him why is the RCP not accountable for making sure that he or her spends 80% of his or her time on reserve. And he said, we don't sign that document, so we're not accountable. I've made it my goal to make it a quad agreement between the RCMP, the feds, the province, and our nation. That way, because it says the officer shall spend 80% of his or her time on reserve, and it doesn't work. They don't do that. Because the places that I went to, detachment commanders is your downtown Merritt, your downtown Ucluelet, your downtown Tofino. I said, no, there's a tripartite agreement, and no. And I reported it to headquarters here in Vancouver. They came and they took the detachment commander's word over mine. And so to me, there wasn't any support, so I got out of Aboriginal policing and I went to highway patrol, and I spent the last years of my career in the RCMP on highway patrol. Yeah, just I'll end it there. Thank you for listening to me, and look forward to discussion and questions if there's any. Clicko.
So thank you all for sitting through our very quick presentation and update. So what I wanted to do for the last half hour that we're together is to have a discussion, and if there are no audience or questions that can be thought of right away, I'm full of questions. If you haven't seen over the past 2 days, I will be the first one to ask a question, because I do believe that the way we make conversation, or the way we make change, is to spark conversation. I often say, by way of my grandma, we shouldn't always all agree, and in fact, the best solutions come from disagreements, because it challenges us to think more creatively, to think more effectively and strategically. And so, Chief Jerry Jack, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a question first of your time in the RCMP. I have worked with a lot of different policing agencies, and I've also heard about the struggles in policing agencies. And I wanted to ask you, from your time in the RCMP to now, have you witnessed, experienced, or have seen any changes in the RCMP regarding their relationship with our communities?
Myself, I have not seen much change. They talk like they do, but the way our people are treated, I often get ashamed that I was part of that organization. You know, because I lost 2 of my relatives from shooting, one in Muchalaht and Chantel Moore in Nova Scotia. I was closely related to her. They come from Cloaquet on Vancouver Island. So as far as change goes, they talk about change and they keep saying they got to do better, but that's all they do is say we got to do better, and they actually don't. It gets really frustrating because when I talk to the Aboriginal policing or First Nations policing inspectors and sergeants, you know, they say there is change, but there isn't. And because on the island in the Muchalaht Tribal Council, there's 14 nations in the Muchalaht Tribal Council, and once a year we get together and talk about policing issues and how can we work better with them. And it does some good. What we did, where I come from, is we made a video. It's called MMFN 101, which is Muchalaht First Nation 101, and it explains our history from contact to today. It explains our governance system. It explains the effects of residential school and why our people have so much troubles today because of residential schools. We've lost 2 or 3 generations of learning how to be a mom and a dad. You know, I always say I'm a survivor of residential school, though I never went, because my dad went and he came home. My mom went and she came home, but when she was in 1st grade, she ended up with TB and she wound up in an Indian hospital. And so as far as working on relationships, they say they do, but I haven't seen much progress myself.
Thank you for that. To expand on residential school, because I think it reverberates to everybody in this room. It is something that is an experience that we have all had the unfortunate experience of learning about in our homes. For myself, and I'm sure this isn't a story unique to me, I know it was not taught in schools, but in our homes it was. And it was difficult to go back into schools that were not ours and to either have the students not believe us or not want to is something that I find so not only disheartening, but maddening. And I'm glad that we are in a time where it is being recognized. And did you ever experience in your time in the RCMP a reluctance to acknowledge the residential school experience? And do you believe that with all the calls to action and with the awareness of residential school, have you, regarding the policing services that are not ours, have you seen any change or discussion that is effective for our people, and or do you believe that more discussion is required so policing services and policing agencies can understand the insurmountable harm they've caused in our communities?
Yes, when I was in, there was a lot of denialism from RCMP members that had a bad effect on our people, and they didn't understand why our First Nations population had so many issues with alcohol and drugs and unemployment and being a parent, like I said. And I heard, firsthand on people's thoughts about it, and it really discouraged me. And that video I talked about we made for our nation, we make sure that the detachment commander in Gold River, all his members watch the video so they know whose territory they're in. And like I said, it explains our history and our governance system, that we're not on an election system, we're on a hereditary system, and the bad effects of residential schools in that video as well.
Of course. As we do move forward and develop our own laws, which is the reason we've all gathered here today, change is difficult in any circumstance, and I do believe that policing agencies have a very difficult time in not only acknowledging the traumatic past that we have all experienced, but also maybe, I don't say maybe, taking ownership in their culpability and their participation in that tragic past. And as we develop our own laws and as we have non-First Nations people working in our communities, perhaps you can describe, from your experience as a police officer and as a chief, the difficulty in having non-First Nations people understand the importance of our bylaws and our laws, and why our mechanisms of enforcement are important for us to enact, rather than utilize the colonial structures that we all know currently don't work and have not worked. Do you see that change being of great difficulty, and what are those difficulties that you assume to encounter?
I believe in our own laws, and I believe that anybody that comes to my nation and wants to live there needs to learn about us. That's why we have that video out of MMFN 101, and it helps them understand, or hopefully it helps them understand us a little bit better. And by talking to people and telling them your story or her story, or whatever the case is, sometimes there's people that come on to our reserve and they shouldn't be there, and that's where we ran into this issue with the bylaws, is that the detachment commander says nope, because when we went through COVID, anybody that 630 is Muchalaht first 3 digits. And we said their bylaw was anybody that's not 630 wasn't allowed on the reserve. And the detachment commanders said they wouldn't listen, and they said they're not doing anything. And that causes mistrust between our nation and the police service, because they won't help us stay safe, and that's what they're there for. They're there to keep our community safe, to keep me safe. Having said that, I always thank them for looking after me. Everywhere I go, I say thank you for looking after me. And we were here at the convention center, and there's a paramedic, and he was in a little room, and I walked in. I said, hey, thank you for looking after me. He said, if my heart gives out, you know what, you're going to look after me and take me to the hospital. I just want to say thank you. And the guy stood up and he started to cry. He said, I've been doing this for 40 years. Nobody's ever said thank you for looking after me. All I get is complaints. He said, I look at somebody sideways and they get complained on. They go through the same thing we do in any first responder position that you're in.
I resonate with that comment, as I constantly champion our ways of being and knowing, and love and respect and kindness. And in the work that I have been doing in police governance, I see the fatigue and the morale in our public safety professionals. And I see that it further tarnishes our young people in wanting to follow in that career or to become police officers. However, to your point, I do see that when we enact kindness in our ways of being, so I'm going to source Rama Police Service, something that they do in moments of mental crises with anyone who is considered a perceived perpetrator, is they will hand them a blade of sweetgrass or a blade of sage to de-escalate the situation, not to yell at them, not to raise the heightened tension in the situation, but to tell the individual who is experiencing strife in their life to say, sit down on the ground and get connection. Here's some medicines, take a moment and breathe. Let's when you can breathe, we will have a discussion. And I often hear from a lot of our people stories. I can say a story of Stony Nakota where a friend of ours experienced extreme harm from the RCMP to the point of abuse, to the point of being left to die. And I find that when we have our own policing services, they can imbue an understanding that is more aligned with our practices, with our people. And a lot of that can also look like enforcement. Enforcement does not need to, and this comes from my elder, enforcement doesn't need to look like going into someone's house with your boots heavy, because you can also be light on yourself. Policing services often show up to people on the worst days in their lives, and also are supposed or expected to show up as the best version of their selves, and I know that's fatiguing. And I would assume that if we were given the reins to develop mechanisms of enforcement that are more aligned with our practices, we may see better outcomes and health and wellness scores of our people. And so, Chief, I wanted to ask you just that. If we were able to implement practices that our police forces could utilize in moments of crises, or utilize when our people need someone to show up for them, do you believe that that can transform our communities or offer a more effective service regarding policing?
Yeah, I believe that there should be a lot more training in dealing with people with mental health issues or alcohol or drug, because they just see a criminal and they're going to take him in no matter what, and they'll use force too much, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help the person. You know, that's what I don't understand. And when I was in the police force and I saw how the other officers worked, it was a lot opposite than me, because I tried to talk to people, and I very seldom used force when I was in Neah Bay, in the States or in Canada. There has to be more training, and the RCMP say they are training, but they don't. They don't look after people the way they should. You know, de-escalation skills, they have none. Yes.
I've heard when I was in Aurelia, another perspective that was mentioned regarding enforcement is also to simply show up for people. To show up for people as a person, as a human, understanding there is a job to be done, and when you do need to arrest somebody because somebody is committing a crime, that is something that we need to account for. We also don't want to commit any of our people to, as was stated here yesterday, having a record which can almost be another life sentence. Do you believe that with, or perhaps your perspective on enforcement, do you feel that with enforcement of our laws, we might be able to, and this is also coming from many of the people in my family who have found themselves on the receiving end of a crime, we might be able to offer them a way forward rather than burden them with a punishment?
Yeah, excuse me, I strongly believe in that. If we were allowed to enforce our own laws, because we do things different, we look after our people, we don't punish them. Because a long time ago, where I come from, we had Tsuut'ina, and they were wolves. We called them wolves, and they're the peacekeepers and the enforcement. You know, you did something wrong, the Tsuut'ina would take you away and bring you into the woods for 4 days and lecture you and talk to you and tell you how you should be, because something happened at home and they acted a certain way they didn't like. Tsuut'ina would look after them. So I think if making our own laws, we won't go back to that in kind of enforcement. Because I was saying earlier about enforcing our ways, because where I come from, it's not law related, but it's enforcing our ways of living is that when twins were born, Tsuut'ina would take them into the woods for 4 years. Parents would never see their kids, their twins, for 4 years because back where I come from, people believe it's an omen. And they said the fish won't come back as strong if the Tsuut'ina didn't look after them. But I think our ways would do a better job in looking after our people because it wouldn't be enforcing to send them to court, to send them to jail. We help them get the skills they need in counseling or talk to somebody, and it would go a lot further, and you'd have less of a problem if we were to help people instead of punish them.
In our language on Tsuut'ina, we say haluaka, which is caring for one another. And we have often talked about, in our self-administered force, introducing our service members to ceremony. Now, this is to say we are not relinquishing any of anything that is sacred to us, but rather imbuing a meaning. I know we often put our policing forces as those in our community who are not a First Nation or Indigenous. We go through cultural awareness, but a step further that one of our elders has done is cultural meaning practices. When you have a meaning behind something, people have a tendency to align it with something more intrinsic than just an awareness. And awareness is so important, but I'm so grateful for this elder for doing that. And something that we have done in our self-administered is to introduce the service members who choose to in our ceremonies, or introduce them in audience to our ceremonies, in our naming practices, to introduce them, to bring them to Sweat Lodge and experience what that feels like. So they understand as service members that when they are in our community providing policing services, that we have a meaning behind everything we do. And often our ceremonies are a way forward for our people that are not jail systems. And I wanted to ask you, because it often can be controversial as well, do you believe, or your perspective on ceremony and policing, and should those two have complement with one another, and do you see a benefit in introducing ceremony to service members serving our communities?
Where I come from, I've been trying to get the officers to our nation when we're having a ceremony go on, because they need to understand how our people are and live, and the importance of ceremony. Like, you get into an accident, we feed our people, and we have a ceremony, and we have songs and dances that we use, and we do it right away. And so that if a police officer comes to our nation more than they do, and they understand us, we'd all be a lot better. We'd be way better off, because they're reactive, they're not proactive. And reactive is no way to be. You gotta be proactive in our communities, and we don't see that. They only show up when something's going on, but they don't interact with our community enough, and I keep saying it every time I meet with the sergeant. Hopefully things will change. You know, if I keep at it, it'll change, I hope.
I wanted to ask all of you to join us in this conversation. If anybody had anything that you wanted to ask or to share, or was there any clarity that needed to be provided? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jenny LaRue from Muchalaht First Nations. And on the subject, I did share a little bit earlier with you. I have attended policing and policy gatherings, information gathering sessions, and this was within the British Columbia region, and it was a very, I would have to say, not enough time. I remember the presenter, I was asked to be a speaker at one of them. They didn't have enough time, they were very pressed, they were really under pressure to get these, to just organize it in general, and to get enough information to have people come. And when I was at some of these meetings, I was the only person, maybe one or two others, that were Indigenous. And I felt like we really needed to be there to talk about exactly what we're doing right now at these meetings. It was funded by the Department of Justice, I believe, and the only thing, to make the long story short, the only thing that I saw come out of it to date is that the police are wearing body cameras. And that's what I see visually. I don't know if there was any other changes in regards to that information gathering. And I just think that more needs to be done. We need more tangible, we need to see things. We need to have an example of what these focus groups are bringing about. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
I can touch on that, and it also might spark another question that I'd love to hear from you, which is what you're describing as policing governance. As the chair of the Governance Council in Canada and as the chair of my Governance Council, or as the co-chair of my governance on Tsuut'ina Nation, governance is the mechanism that oversees the service of policing. We are in every province except for Quebec, we are the boss of the chief of police, and we indicate the practices of the service, including how enforcement is being enacted. We are that body that keeps arm's length away from our leadership, so that leadership does not utilize the police force as a personal security service, or does not mechanize, or there isn't a conflict of interest there. Another part of governance is to be transparent and accountable back to community. And I think that is a huge area of opportunity across Canada. I do believe that as governance actors, we can build better capacity as it comes to the communication mechanisms, so that community also has a voice in making the changes needed for governance. Governance is that authority that oversees and provides that accountability back to the service, leadership, and community. And a huge area of opportunity with policing services, and I hope to be not only act as a leader on Tsuut'ina Nation, but also in with Chief Dwayne Zachary in Ganawage, with chiefs of police all over the nation, Chief Keith Blake, the chiefs of police at Lakeshore and Kainai. We just had a really robust meeting last week with their governance components, their commissions, to also determine what communication mechanisms and responsibly communication mechanisms can we imbue back to the community to provide transparency on both the good and the concerning regarding policing services, because at the end of a period and at the end of the week, at the end of the day, when the sun sets and we look towards tomorrow, we do have to make sure that the service being provided back to all of you is accountable, because we are public service members, we are public service, and it is a huge area of opportunity. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the accountability and the messaging back from policing services back into community, and possibly how transparent should we be, and what messaging would you recommend we developed to give back to community in order for community to be empowered in the service of policing?
We should be with each other, with both the police and our nation and our leadership, fully transparent on what we want and what we need. When I go to the police office, I usually go there once a week and have a coffee with Sergeant Young and tell them what we want from our nation. But the only downfall is the officers don't come up and learn about us and meet us, you know. And I strongly believe that we'd get there. And one of the things that I want to do is have a say in who comes to police our community. Like, there should be an interview process, because we have officers that go to Gold River because it's a limited duration post. After their 4 years, they get to choose where they want to go, and that's not a reason to go somewhere. You go there because you want to work with people. We've had incidents where police officers dislike First Nations people, and it shows. We had one there for 4 years. He never said one word to me. I even went to go shake his hand on Christmas Day. We're going into the store at the same time, and he just put his head in the air, walked into the store, and never acknowledged me. And, you know, it's kind of those kinds of things that we have to be wary of and work together with, you know, because if we explain what we want, they can tell us what they can do and what they can't do, and we'll all be better off if there's a personal relationship. Because I know I try my best, because Deputy Commissioner, his name escapes me, right? The commanding officer of E Division.
Yeah.
I email him quite a bit, and he emails me back, and he's actually going to come up to Gold River in next month, because one of our carvers made a totem pole, and they're putting it in front of the police office, because it was important to them to know that there's a relationship between us and them. And you know, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of nice police officers, yeah, but there are ones that shouldn't be in our communities.
Absolutely. Any more questions from anyone in the audience?
I wanted to make sure the online participants had a chance to weigh in too, because they did have a question for you. Also, Chief Jack, could I get a list after this of everyone who's ever disrespected you, so that I can add it to the list of people who have personally disrespected me? Okay, so from online. Indigenous sovereignty beyond colonial constructs. I question whether true self-determination can ever be achieved within Canada as a framework. Can a First Nations truly free itself from Canada under international law? And if so, what practical steps must be taken to assert and maintain full independence? Oh, and we have 15 minutes left.
All good. So my answer to that's a lot of what was described in that question is subjective. Full independence, that's subjective. What do you define that as? Sovereignty, that is also subjective. Where do you determine you're sovereign? I'd imagine that many people on their nations wouldn't designate a chief as their sovereign, and we don't want to designate that back to the crown. So it also depends on what is defined by full independence, because we live now in an ecosystem where the newcomers, they're here and they're everywhere, and I even married one. That's to say that all of those sovereignty, full independence, autonomy, how are we describing that? How are we defining that? And what does that mean for our people and on a move forward? We can develop constitutions which may offer us a framework for autonomy and to self-government. From that, who are we designating as our sovereign? And who are we delegating that authority back to? When we talk about full independence, does that mean economic independence? Law writing? Does it mean holding and administering the authorship and ownership of our programs, of the administration of what we have to deem as our essential service? We also have to think about economy. To everybody in the audience, I recommend reading a book by Tom Sewall on the fundamentals and basics of economy, because we also live in a system that heavily relies on interdependency regarding trade, regarding the scarcity, and like for one First Nation, for instance, the Garden of Eden, just to use it as an example, that would be an example of a self-sustaining mechanism, but it is not economy. Economy does rely on a partnership. So a really great example is economy also has to now be set by prices, because we no longer trade in the traditional ways of which we did prior to colonization. Buffalo hides, beads, medicines, and to some extent water, depending on fisheries. And so we have to account for several components regarding independence, regarding self-autonomy, and even a breakaway from Canada. What does that mean and what does that look like? We live now in a country, we live now in a time where there is a requirement for military. And I don't necessarily support that. I don't purport wars or want them to be occurring or operated. We now live in a system globally connected by internet, by planes, by transportation mechanisms that do have to account for the sources of economy that also drive forward our nations. We are sitting in a city, we are sitting in a built space that is heavily reliant on us participating in the economy for it to move forward. Energy, we no longer rely on the sources of energy that we did prior to contact. We live in a space with, I think we all have computers, electricity, running water. These are all components, so it's to say, that is subjective, but has to also account for a lot of very real distinctions that are indicated by the colonial structures that be. So it's to say we live in an ecology that we also rely on, and we rely on each other because that's economy. Margaret Thatcher said it best when she met with Mikhail Baryshnikov when they were both in power, where he asked her, because in Russia there is only 10% of the land is arable, so you can't feed by sourcing your own agriculture. You can't feed everyone in Russia. You do, and neither can the United Kingdom. I think less than 1/8% of their land is arable. And they also don't have systems that can account for the need for food for those people. And us too, we need food. This all to say, so when Mikhail Baryshnikov asked Margaret Thatcher, the leader then, who did understand economy, how do you make it so that the people of your country eat, to which she reported, I don't, prices do. We have to account for the price and the cost of things in order to sustain, in order to maintain sustenance, and to sustain what we now live in, which is globally connected economies that are heavily reliant on partnerships. Otherwise, we face scarcity, and scarcity can lead to a lot of other very real issues and problems. And so in that question, and I hope I at least provided perspective on it, I know I wasn't able to answer it, there's a lot in that question that is subjective and will require the consensus of your people to define what that means and what that is.
We have an audience question.
Gorbachev, sorry, a Russian dude.
Galen Kasla, Plakohila, Hitman Likami Yakuntalov. Chief Jack, we are connected. I'm Penlatch from Qualicum, the Rakelma family, and Numbis from Alert Bay, the Cranmer and the Hunts families. My great-grandfather, Dan Cranmer, was also arrested for potlatching in 1921. And 21 years ago, when I was pregnant with my son, I hiked the old grease trail from the head of Nimkish Lake to your beautiful territory. My question is more of a curiosity, and it relates to my old career as a family law lawyer. And whenever I represented an ex-wife of an RCMP officer, I would be stopped regularly in my car and asked to produce my ID and asked irrelevant questions about where I was going and what I'm doing. And I understood that it was a very soft form of harassment, and I understood that I was quite privileged because likely they knew that I was a lawyer. And so I had certain protections. But I'd always wondered, is that in your experience with the RCMP, were you ever asked to, or were you ever aware of people in the force saying, like, that one, like, that's your new favorite person to pull over or see if you can catch doing something?
It's called selective policing, because it does happen. I've seen it happen where they'll target somebody because they dislike them, and they'll randomly pull them over. Because in British Columbia, to be pulled over, you don't need to be doing anything wrong. You don't have. All you need to be is walking or driving, and you can be stopped and asked questions. And I don't think that is right, but that's the way the law reads. I mean, when I policed in Washington State, I couldn't pull somebody over because I wanted to. They had to do something wrong. The police chief gave me a task one day. He said, my sister's gonna come onto the Quinault Reservation with I won't repeat what he said, but a load of meth, and I need you to stop her. So I did, and I followed her for 20 minutes before she did something that I could pull her over for, and I did find meth. I called it selective policing when they target somebody just because they don't like their views on something, or they disagree with what they do, and that's wrong, and thank you for bringing up the grease trail, because when Callaghan got married, he married that lady, Alfred lady from Mullard Bay, and they brought her up Nimkish River to Wass Lake, and then down into Tassus, because Tassus belongs to me and my family. And that's how we're related. I got, my name is Nimkish Klakugela, copper maker. I was told it is what it means. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Do we have one more in the room?
Chief Jack, I just wanted to know, correctional services officers, are they also governed under peace officer standards? It's just something that was thrown back and forth between myself and others in that area. They just wanted to know if they were underneath that same title. If you knew that.
I never really thought about it, and I don't really know. I can't answer you. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I would have to say yes, though.
Yeah,
Right.
Alberta is a yes,
Yeah.
but I don't know. That depends on the province.
Sorry, Teddy, I took your mic.
No, no, no.
And I do have another online question. Unless I have a question online for Chief Jack, but if someone in the room has a question for Teddy, I'll give you the mic.
I've been talking for days.
Okay. So the question from online here is, Chief Jack, how do you deal with the RCMP about recognizing your traditional governance? Taku River Tlingit First Nations had an RCMP say to us, "You don't even make BCRs." We make clan directives because we use the traditional clan system of governance. He actually quoted the Indian Act to us, stating that there is nothing about clan directives in the Indian Act. Therefore, clan directives have no validity.
I think, like this case, for instance, again, it's selective policing on what you want to do, because as for a BCR, my wife is from Comox Nation, and she had her house rented out to somebody, and he was destroying it. The police were there every night, and it became a safety issue. And I told her her mom was on council. I said, go see your chief and council, get a BCR, and have him evicted immediately. Don't give him 1 day or 2 days or a week, because he'll have an eviction party. And that's what happened. They got the BCR. They went to the police office. The First Nations liaison went to her house and served him a document and said, out now. So it does work sometimes. Not all the time. It's not every day that they're going to enforce a band council resolution, which they should.
Okay, I think I could follow up with a further question from this person, but I think they were saying, oh, you don't even make BCRs. They do make BCRs, but they were just saying you're not taking the option. Okay, I get it. Sorry. Thank you so much. We're out of time today. After this, we're going to have a 10-minute break, so we'll get back together at 55 minutes after 3 in the main plenary room, please. Thank you so much, Teddy, and thank you, Chief Jack, for being nimble and so open tonight with us. Thank you.